I can't find the flag image.
That's okay. We'll miss that tonight then. Good evening. I'd like to call to order the December 8th, 2020 Harwich Board of Selectmen's meeting. This is a special meeting focused on the wastewater issues, and I'll bring it into. I'll just call a roll call to put us in open meeting. Don?
Here.
Michael?
Here.
And I'm here. So there's three of us, and as I noticed before, Ed will be here, I assume, in about 10 minutes. So he'll join us during the meeting. Joe, I'll move on to the agenda then and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to you and members of the board, thanks for being here. Mr. Chairman, as you know, I've been working with the staff. We are represented this evening by our wastewater superintendent, Dan Pelletier, town engineer, Griffin Ryder, finance director, Carol Capola. And the four of us have been meeting regularly now, weekly, on any items related to wastewater, because we know that there are some decisions that are coming up that may impact upon the 2021 annual town meeting. And building off of a conversation that Selectman Ballantyne and Howell had, we have this meeting here tonight. So what I would like to do is just offer to the selectmen that are present right now that what Dan, Griffin, Carol, and I have been working on is to try to get information to the board first, and then obviously through the board to the general public. I have a quick document that I'm going to share that I'll speak to momentarily, and then turn it over to Dan for the bulk of the presentation. But Mr. Chairman, I know that you, as mentioned before, wanted to be updated on activities related to the intermunicipal agreement, or IMA, that we have with the town of Chatham. That's one of the topics we can get into tonight to some degree. I know Selectman Howell, you've asked or talked before about the potential agreement with the DHY Clean Waters Partnership. And I know Selectman McCaskill has mentioned, a topic related to the East Harwich Sewer Service, what we refer to as Phase 2 Potential Contract 3. So we're ready to have discussions on those preliminary tonight. I do want to emphasize, as you may have noticed on the agenda, that for the four topics that we have listed, the intent was for discussion. Mr. Chairman and members, as you're familiar with your regular meetings, we did not use the phrase discussion and possible vote. This is meant to be a high-level discussion to help the selectmen kickstart the first of many discussions on many issues related to wastewater. So if I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to draw everyone's attention to the document that I have in the packet very quickly, and then I'll turn it over to our wastewater superintendent.
Thank you, Joe.
Let me try and share that screen. Not the one I wanted to share. Not the one I want to share. This is fun. So there we go. So Mr. Chairman, members of the board, you'll see in the packet the document that says Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan, Elements and Components. You'll see in the left-hand column that there are the three major projects, if you will. Within that, we have the East Harwich Sewer Service area. And I know Selectman Howell, we've had conversations in the past, at least here in Harwich, trying to differentiate between a DHY Phase 1 versus a Town of Harwich Phase 3, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm trying to normalize the use of the EHSSA that talks about what's going on in East Harwich. We're familiar with DHY, and then of course we're all familiar with the document that really gave life to those two other items, being the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan. And as we've been meeting as a group and discussing, I've tried to crystallize the three major areas or the three components that staff has been dealing with generally that relate to each of these elements that you can see in the project column. So we know that we have questions of financing for each of the three projects that have been made, that need to be made, or will need to be made in the future. I've put in some placeholders just for general points right now, where we're dealing with governance issues. You know, governance for East Harwich relates to sewer regulations, the IMA, the wastewater, the watershed permit, DHY, there's the potential agreement. So you can see some of the issues that we'll be dealing with on governance. And then last component is operations. So you'll see that there are boxes that have some data and boxes that are empty. This is meant to be a refined document over time that I'll be drawing upon to highlight any relevant issues that come up related to any of the three projects that you see there and any of the three components that we may need to deal with. And so I offer that just to really as a framework that I've tried to develop to sort of start making sense of all this, but also to try and keep track of the components that we need to be mindful of. So what we see today is not necessarily what we'll see in 6 months, in a year, and so on and so forth. And so I wanted everyone to bear that in mind as we then get into the full topic. With the full topic, Mr. Chairman, unless there's questions for me on that document, I'd like to hand it directly over to our wastewater superintendent for a deep dive into his presentation.
Joe, let me interrupt just for a second and say that Ed McManus has joined us. So he's now part of the discussion. And I'll move on then to Dan then.
Mr. Chair, before that?
Yes, Don.
I just want to make it really clear, especially off of one of the statements that Michael made last night, and it was, you know, it's a valid statement. That's kind of why I pushed this. No matter what we've got, and I don't want anybody to read into what Joe just did, you can have a warrant article out there, and we can draft one, but we've been discussing that we need to do the groundwork ahead of time, and we have to start a conversation somewhere. And the Board of Selectmen has to actually dive deeply into this to be able to make some decisions so that the public knows, you know, what we're inclined to do. So anything that you're watching tonight, I'm even more emphatic than what Joe said, is because we haven't had a comprehensive discussion about any of this stuff together. It's one cohesive conversation.
Thank you, Don. Dan?
Yes.
No, Dan Pelletier.
Oh, Dave Pelletier, I'm sorry.
Good evening. Let me just share my screen here.
Your microphone should be off.
Let me know if everyone has that up on their screen.
We do.
All right, great. Well, thank you. I appreciate the time tonight to present and hope you find the information valuable in your discussions. The goal of the presentation is to provide an understanding of the major milestones and decisions the town has made since the adoption of the CWMP in 2016, and further expand upon some of the technical information relating to East Harwich Contract 3 and DHY discussions. So, I'd like to provide a brief history of the events that brought us to where we are today. In 2016, the town adopted a living document known as the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan. Initial actions taken under the CWMP include Phase 1 with the widening of Muddy Creek Inlet, and a lesser known component of Phase 2, which was the funding of the Coldbrook project in 2017. It was in 2018 when the town took its first notable deviation from the CWMP by authorizing and instructing the board to draft special legislation relative to DHY. It was at that same town meeting in 2018, the town also voted to approve funding for the Phase 2 construction. Due to its size and scope, the Phase 2 area was divided initially into 2 construction contracts. After design was completed, the first contract was advertised for bids in May of 2019. Due to the unanticipated bid overrun, the town deviated again from its intended path on the CWMP by reducing the second construction contract in scope and budget, resulting in an additional unfunded Contract 3. Additional progress on DHY in the past year or so include Governor Baker signing the Chapter 88 Acts of 2019, the DHY peer review study that was completed by Weston and Sampson, and the development of a Harwich Center study area and sewer CAD model for use in determining flows for DHY. The cost and magnitude of these infrastructure projects cannot go unmentioned. DHY and Contract 3 present a unique set of questions regarding affordability, regulatory and IMA implications, watershed permit, timing, funding, etc. So to move forward, I'm going to start in the East Harwich Sewer Service Area. So what happens if we delay Contract 3? The short answer is a delay in Contract 3 would result in a reduction in flow in East Harwich. That said, there's quite a bit more to the story. The flow reductions will have implications in both the IMA and the watershed permit. The IMA has two components relative to flows generated in East Harwich: flow variable operating expenses and purchase capacity fee schedule. The fee schedule for the Chatham plant includes 4 payments. The first 2 are based upon milestones, and the third and fourth have both flow and calendar triggers. The third payment is due upon generating an average daily flow of over 50,000 gallons per day, or 5 years from the date of the agreement. And the fourth payment is due upon generating an average of over 150,000 gallons per day, or 7 years from the date of the agreement. So what will it be? Will the third payment and fourth payment be flow or calendar? So to estimate the weighted average wastewater flows was established, to estimate the flows, a wastewater average flow was established by applying, sorry, I'm reading from a narrative. I'm going to start that one again. To estimate flows, a weighted average wastewater flow was established and applied to the number of service connections, providing an estimated daily wastewater flow. As it relates to the purchase capacity fee schedule, the estimated daily flows for a 1-year order to connect indicate the third payment will be triggered by flow in November of 2021. And with a 2-year order to connect, the third payment will be triggered in June of 2022. The fourth payment will almost certainly be triggered by date in the year 2024, as all 3 construction contracts are projected to generate approximately 120,000 gallons a day, plus inflow and infiltration. So what about our flow variable operating expenses? A reduction in flow will have a corresponding decrease in flow variable expenses. However, because of the way flow variable costs are shared between Harwich and Chatham, the decrease is negligible, as these expenses only make up about 3% of the sewer operating budget. That said, the reduced flow has greater implications with respect to sewer rate revenue and its ability to support the department. Without a sufficient customer base, the sewer operating budget will be limited in its capacity to be self-sufficient and further extend its reliance on funding from general government. Another concern that has been raised is, will our reduced flow have negative impacts on the operation of the Chatham wastewater treatment plant? And speaking with the operators at the plant, they advised that there'd be no negative impacts on plant operations or effluent water quality resulting from lower than anticipated flows. So before I go further and jump into the next component, I guess I'd give this an opportunity to allow questions, or I can continue on if there isn't any.
Dan, how you continue on at this point?
No, let's
Have a
not.
good explanation of our obligations going forward. Yes.
Hey, Larry. Thank you. Can we pause on this as recommended by Dan?
Yep.
Dan, you were going fairly fast on that. And I can't see the bottom chart. It's very small and I'm having trouble blowing it up on my computer. First payment's been made to the town of Chatham. Second payment, what's the anticipated date of the second payment?
So that's due on commencement of flow. So when we send out the orders to connect, that's when we'll be on the hook for that payment. The way that the construction schedules are laying out right now, I could see that June, July. So it's going to be within the next
June or July of this year.
Yeah.
And then give us an idea what you think, and I will not hold you to this. Give me an idea what you think we're going to send to Chatham for the first year. How many homes, not gallons?
So you know, I mean, it really boils down to the order to connect, right? And how much we enforce it, and also the ability to get the connections made. You know, I think to try to get 440 homes connected in 1 year is a stretch. You know, with winters, to put a number on it, because you're asking me and you said you won't hold me to it. I mean, 25% to 50%. At most?
Say that one more time.
25 to 50% of the 440. So
25 to 50. Okay, this board's had a conversation about, just because of practicality, about not connection order being 2 years instead of 1 year. So I just want to remind the board of that. Okay, let's go to the third payment. Third payment of 1.5 million is going to be due in 2022, no matter what.
yes,
So the town of Harwich will then be borrowing another 3 million by 2022 on contract 2, or through contract 2 of phase 2, and then another 1.5 million in 2024. Now let's talk about, real quick, can we talk about if we send 50,000 gallons, let's just say we're going to send 25%, which I think, by the way, is high. If we talk about the first year, there's a lot of residents that want to hook up to this, but there's also a lot of residents saying they're never going to hook up to this. And I know that you've heard those conversations because you and I have talked about it. So if we send 50,000 gallons of our anticipated 300,000 gallons for the 600 homes that we originally sold town meeting on, what are the O&M costs going to be due to the town of Chatham? 1, based on gallons, and 2, based on their fixed cost and the agreement that we've already made.
so the fixed costs really make up the biggest component of what we're going to be obligated to pay Chatham on a quarterly basis. So, and those costs are pretty, let me make up a big component of the budget. Bear with me 1 second. I can give you an exact figure. Just move this over.
Thank you for indulging me on this, because I think this is the most important part of the conversation that we're having tonight, because this is what we've already spent $30 million on.
All right. So, budget.
Or more.
All right. So when I prepared the budget for FY22, I made 3 budgets. I made one with a 1-year order to connect to do flow projections, one with a 2-year order to connect to do flow projections, and then I did a third one with an average hookup rate of 5 connections per month. So let me just open this up here.
So Dan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but on the fixed cost, it's my understanding that it doesn't make any difference at all whether we send them 10 gallons or we send them 300,000 gallons. The fixed costs are the fixed costs.
That's correct.
So can we start with the fixed costs?
Yeah, so fixed costs are about $180,000 for what we're going to be on the hook for to Chatham, regardless of flow or anything else.
Okay, and that has nothing to do with our operating budget for your team that's going to take over the operation of this once the water starts flowing, correct?
Correct.
So the second number that you were getting to based on 1 year, 2 year, and 5 connections a month, where are you at for 1 year and 2 year?
So for 1 year, so the fixed costs stay the same for 1 year and 2 year, that 180,000. And then the flow variable, can't do the math in my head. Bear with me 1 second.
It's okay, I can't read the screen because that is micro print.
Yeah, it's the total difference between the 5 per month and the 1 year to connect in flow variable operating expenses was $20,000. So it's going to be $20,000 less a year in our payment to Chatham with a reduced flow. And if we send all 440 houses and every gallon we got, it's going to cost $20,000 more. So that's really the point, is a lot of this lies in the fixed cost to what we owe Chatham.
And then Dan, what's the your operating budget that you've figured based on your connection, what you think people are going to connect? What is the operating budget going to be for the sewer department for the town of Harwich?
So the biggest thing that I'm looking at with that right now, or the biggest unknown, is we don't have yet a operations contract with a vendor to do the physical day-to-day operations of the collection system. Initial estimates were going to be, $300,000 a year, and this was based off of a memo that I got from Weston and Sampson. But that $300,000 was inclusive of equipment, vehicles, and all the various things that we can either provide them or we can share those assets with the town of Chatham. So I don't have a firm number yet, but Harwich only expenses, I would estimate, around $200,000 to $300,000 per year.
Okay.
And those are fixed.
So on the low end, we're at $380,000 once we send a gallon to Chatham.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's all I have. And thank you, Dan, for that information.
Yeah, no problem. I'll continue on. Let me just move to the next slide. All right. So in addition to considering flows and their impact on the IMA, it's also important to understand the regulatory requirements and commitments the town has made as a permittee of the first of its kind watershed permit issued in 2018. The watershed permit is intended to allow for the adaptive management and mitigation of nitrogen through traditional and non-traditional technologies, as outlined in the Pleasant Bay Targeted Watershed Management Plan, or TWMP. So what is the Targeted Watershed Management Plan? So the plan contains a 20-year implementation schedule with tasks and nitrogen removal commitments for each of the 4 permittees, as well as joint tasks to be completed by all towns. Completed actions to date include the Muddy Creek Bridge, development of the Targeted Watershed Management Plan, execution of the IMA, and obtaining the watershed permit itself. Presently, we are in the first phase of the watershed permit, which includes calendar years 2019 to 2023, and includes the installation of the Phase 2 sewers intended to remove 2,672 kilograms of nitrogen per year. Also enacting a fertilizer reduction bylaw, which offers a credit of 200 kilograms per year nitrogen removed. The first permit phase also calls for the remodeling of Pleasant Bay, which is ongoing and expected to be completed in January. The purpose for remodeling Pleasant Bay is to evaluate the increased flushing of Muddy Creek to determine its effects on nitrogen loading and attenuation thresholds. This is an important component with respect to adaptive management, as changes in these nitrogen thresholds will have a direct impact on the calculation used to determine how much nitrogen is removed and credited through the installation of sewers. We can see on the Muddy Creek salinity graph that the salinity of Upper Muddy Creek has risen after the widening of the inlet, which is indicative of increased flushing. The increased flushing is also anticipated to be more effective in transporting nitrogen from Muddy Creek to Pleasant Bay, where it can be more easily accepted by the bay's higher loading threshold. Oh, sorry. So what does that mean with respect to Phase 2 Contract 3? So the town's commitment to remove the 2,672 kilograms of nitrogen per year in the plan was based upon nitrogen thresholds established in reports originating in 2006 and 2010, with some updates along the way. Remodeling Pleasant Bay will establish new sub-watershed thresholds to better inform nitrogen mitigation strategies in the subsequent phases. Should the town postpone Contract 3, it would afford the opportunity to evaluate the proposed design against the latest nitrogen loading and attenuation thresholds. And this is a new slide to the packet today. So in response to the Pleasant Bay Watershed Permit 2020 annual report submitted this past October, Mass DEP has acknowledged the funding issues associated with the construction in East Harwich, and also that the town is considering reprioritizing its efforts in other watersheds. DEP has advised that the town should decide its course of action by year 3 to allow for adequate time for Mass DEP to review and develop consensus with Brewster, Chatham, and Orleans, our fellow permittees. And in addition, as part of the next annual report, the town should document nitrogen removal efforts achieved from contracts 1 and 2 in any revised plans. So the reason this is new is because it came in yesterday afternoon, but I thought it was important because it is correspondence directly from DEP pertaining to the conversation we're having tonight. So I guess I would give another opportunity to break if there are any other questions before shifting gears to DHY.
Dan, I have one. Larry, can I?
Please, go ahead.
So Dan, we talked about the 180,000 a year Chatham's getting, whether we send a gallon or 300,000 gallons. Well, what's the difference between whether or not, so the non-fixed cost, the flow costs, whether or not we send them, let's say 100,000 gallons versus 300,000 gallons? What's the not sending them 200,000 gallons? How does that affect them on their revenue side? So if they're expecting up to 300,000 gallons, which is a big reason why they did this, if we don't send them that, what do they lose?
I can't speak to what they would lose as far, so you mean financially, like from what they would be losing from our payment?
Yeah, and I guess I would just ask it a different way. On the flow costs, so we have the fixed cost of 180,000. On the flow costs, what are we paying per gallon to Chatham to send our stuff?
So if I can just give a brief explanation of how the flow variable costs are calculated, because I think it's important to understand that to get the point across, I guess. So the way that our flow variable costs are calculated within the IMA and in the agreement is the total Harwich flow is measured as a percentage of Chatham's total flow, right? So because we're only sending, even at sending them 300,000 gallons per day, we're still such a, to be honest, negligible percentage of their total gallons through the plant that the costs are really negligible. So when we were talking before about sending them just contracts 1 and 2, 50,000 or more with the order to connect, right? If I can jump back a couple slides. So the order to connect, the 1-year order to connect had a difference of 40,000 gallons, which equated to about $20,000 in expense difference. So to extrapolate that out, $100,000. I don't think I can do the formula for you, but I don't have it off the top of my head, and I'd rather be able to.
Yeah, I think you gave me enough. That 20,000 for 40,000 gallons is plenty. And when we toured the plant and when we were negotiating this deal, when we talk about 300,000 being negligible, it's really not, because they were only, I believe, at about 900,000 gallons for all of the areas that they had already sewered. And their problem was, and a big reason they came to the table, was because their plant wasn't being efficiently used because they weren't processing enough gallons. So the selling point to them was to get their plant to a certain point so that they could tell where the effluent was ultimately ending up, and if they could reduce their operating costs by teaming up with us for the 300,000 gallons or up to 300,000 gallons.
Right. To be honest, when I looked at the dollar difference between the flow variable expenses, I was I was very surprised because I thought they were going to make up a lot more of what the costs were, but a lot of them are really buried in the fixed costs.
Can I,
You answered my question because we're giving them 180,000 whether we send a gallon or 20. So I think that you're right. They were smart enough to put the bulk of that in their in the payment that's for fixed costs.
Right.
if I may, a couple general comments. Michael, you make a good point. We do need to come back and look at the 1 year versus 2 year based on this discussion. And also, before we leave this subject, I think you referred to, there are two aspects. You know, if we send less flow, you're right, they're smart having a fixed cost, because what that does is allow them to hook more of their, handle more of their flow in Chatham before they have to expand the plant. And so in this case, they kind of have their cake and eat it too. They'll get our money and they'll not have to follow through their long-term plan to increase their size. The other aspect, Michael, you referred to is that part of their push to get our flow was to closer to the 300,000 was to win the argument with DEP whether they could recharge the effluent where they are now, or whether we'd have to take some of it back in Harwich. And so our benefit is for them to get their flow up, and then hope that our read of the situation is that they can handle the effluent with no problem.
Larry, it's Don.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I'm more concerned about what just got sent from DEP yesterday, because buried in that talks about them requiring a modification to our permit. You know, if we start reconfiguring it, it also talks in terms of we either have to document, which is entirely impossible because we haven't had hookup 1 even happen yet, what the remediation removal is, or we'd have to predict it.
So can I jump in on that? Couple points. So just real quick, when we're talking about flows again, with respect to, ours, I finally found my table that I was looking for. Our flow variable expenses are based, per quarter. And I did all the math with Chatham's annual monthly flows, and with a 1 year order to connect with all 440 customers for, Q4 of 22, which would be next April, May, and June, when we had, theoretically would have had everyone connected. Our flow only makes up 6.5% of Chatham's flow for that whole quarter. So it kind of speaks to the small, how small our flows are, I guess, in comparison to theirs. But to Don's point, with respect to documenting and quantifying the nitrogen, that's actually a task that's being done through the Alliance. With Wright Pierce has been working, I've been working with them and going through this evaluation, looking at how much nitrogen credit we're going to get for the contracts 1 and contracts 2, how much nitrogen we would have, would get if we moved forward with contract 3, as well as, and then documenting with the plan. So DEP has been amicable to this, it at least appears to be in our conversations in the Alliance meetings. And part of the whole targeted watershed management plan is that it is adaptable and it's designed to account for, changes. So if we do decide to do something, obviously there's implications with Chatham, Brewster, and Orleans, right? So DEP has to take them into account as well. But I think what they're just saying is that once we figure out what we want to do, we have to pitch it back to them, back to the Alliance, see what implications that will have for the watershed plan in its entirety, and if there's any negatives to it. Now, an important thing to note is with the remodeling of Pleasant Bay, it's going to have, impacts on all 4 towns in our nitrogen thresholds and what we're looking at. So we're not really alone in needing or potentially revising our plan.
Don, I read this as a positive response from DEP, as Dan has said. They've said that they're willing to work with us. We not only have this watershed permit, if we do anything with DHY, we'll have to modify our CWMP. And the same thing, DEP is all along has said they're willing to work with us to make any adjustments that make sense.
Don't misread me. I'm not saying that it's punitive. What I'm saying is inferred into this is you're going to do something. Because currently, we had agreed to certain things to happen at certain times in the CWMP, and it's basically saying, okay, but we're going to have to revisit that, and you're going to still have to be on the hook for doing something sequentially after what you've done. That plus, I also want to make sure, because it doesn't say anything in here about quantification of what just happened with rebuilding the bridge, Muddy Creek. I think we all talked about that more efficiently taking nitrogen out of the area.
So that is actually located, if you can see, let me check this out, spotlight. So right here, if you can see that highlight, so these bars that go all the way across are joint tasks for all 4 towns. And that is where the remodeling of Pleasant Bay is located as an action item.
Okay, but I'm not wrong, though, that they're actually asking us, if you're not going to do contract 3, tell us what you are going to do, because we're going to have to reconfigure your permit. Isn't that really what this is saying?
Can you ask that again? Sorry.
As I look at this, this is saying, if you don't do contract 3, that's okay, but you're going to have to show us what it is you are going to do in lieu of that. Because they're asking you to recertify the permit.
Larry, you're muted.
We have to remove the nitrogen that we've agreed to. What DEP has always said is that there is some flexibility in the schedule of doing that, because they realize what we're going through. That's what this implies on this. We can't back away from our commitment, only to the extent that Dan implied that the amount of nitrogen that we require to remove may change as we get more data showing the Muddy Creek's been cleaned up, that has been cleaned up to some extent. But we'll still have to stick with our commitment. They're saying that we have some leeway on the basically on the timing of that.
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying, and I wanted the public to hear that, because you forgive the pun, but one flows from the other here. I mean, if we don't do contract 3, there is still a mandate that we remove some quantity of nitrogen, and we got to demonstrate where that would be.
Exactly. And the Muddy Creek was at the beginning was an interesting discussion, because they were they being DEP was not too excited about giving us credit for that, because it was done before the discussion started on this watershed permit. And I think in the end, I think as Dan was pointing out, in the end, they did give us some credit for that, but that was a big argument on what was the starting point.
Larry?
Yes.
And the way that I'm reading this conversation is the 4 towns right now, because of lack of data, we may be getting a pass. However, when the data arrives, if we're not removing the amount of nitrogen out of Pleasant Bay that we said we were going to, and out of the watershed, then we are going to have to start removing more. So if Muddy Creek doesn't work the way that they're anticipating it's going to work, we ultimately will have to remove that nitrogen from that watershed. And one of my things from the beginning of this has been, sure, we can start a DHY agreement, but we're now talking about doing it based on an unknown. And once we start that other part of town and DHY agreement, what if DEP comes back in and says, now you guys got to get back on contract 3 because you guys aren't removing enough out of Pleasant Bay? We don't know, right? Based on what they're saying.
Well,
may I?
Go ahead.
So I was trying to keep this high level. I'm happy to go as deep as the conversation takes it. So I put the former slide back up on the screen. So you'll see in the image on the left where you see Mill Pond, Upper Muddy Creek, Hawks Nest Pond. Those are all individual sub-watersheds within Pleasant Bay. And each one of those sub-watersheds has its independent nitrogen attenuation threshold. So it's not so much that we don't have the data, it's that the data set has changed because the river has changed, the creek has changed because of the increased flushing, right? So the attenuation thresholds that were developed for the watersheds as you see them now are going to change because the water body itself has changed due to the increased flushing. So what we need to do is just understand what that change is, better or worse, and then how do we react from it.
Okay.
Thank you, Dan. That furthers my point, I think. We don't know, right? And we're not to DHY yet, but we don't know. We have to know. But if we embark on another wastewater project, it's likely that the residents of the town of Harwich could be forced back into phase 3 if we find out and it doesn't meet what we're supposed to be removing.
Michael, we're going to end this presentation with a possible scenario that maybe will help your discussion.
Larry, could I take one question, please? This is John Chory.
John, sure.
I apologize for being late. I thought the meeting started at 6:30. Dan, tremendous amount of information you're pumping out here, no pun intended. But I just have one quick question. On one of the slides there, you said possible in enacting a fertilizer reduction bylaw. Can you briefly tell me what that is and what that means?
Yeah, so the Targeted Watershed Management Plan, right? That's the governing document in East Harwich, had specific activities and action items. And one of those was the enactment of a fertilizer reduction bylaw. In Harwich's component of the plan, it's identified within the phase we're currently in, which takes place from years 2019 to 2023. I had conversations with Megan in the health department as recently as last week. I have provided her with this matrix, the plan outlining the 200 kilogram per year credit. And I believe she is bringing that to her board, though I'm not positive on the date and that.
What does it mean by a ban? Are we going to have homeowners can't fertilize their lawn now? The golf course can't fertilize their golf course?
If I may, the state has regulations that other towns have adopted that says basically that you're not to apply fertilizer in the winter. You can apply some fertilizer. I think it's 1 pound of nitrogen per whatever the area is. During the summer months, because that's when the grass is growing, it will take the nitrogen up. But it's not a ban. It's a regulation or bylaw that says we won't apply nitrogen. I think it's after, I don't know, I'm picking a date, the end of September to May 1st. I don't know exactly, Dan, what the dates are. Because that's when there's nothing, or the growth is slowed down and it's not removing the nitrogen. So it's basically a good cultural practice. The other, the state has adopted that. We can enforce it by using the state regulations. Through the years, early on, there was a reluctance of us in Harwich to do that because we didn't have the resources to enforce it. And that's still the discussion that Megan and group is having, and we as a town have to decide if we do that, how will we enforce it if we do so? But it's not a total ban. It's to moderate the use and use it to minimize nitrogen.
Larry, it's Joe, if I could add to that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and much like I mentioned the potential draft article on the DHY agreement, at present, there is no article to offer up yet. The same is the case with the fertilizer. And if those articles are created, they'll go through their own separate vetting process. So there'll be several opportunities for this board and other boards and other parties to get into those discussions more directly.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. John, you okay? Can Dan move on?
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, Dan, and Joe and Larry.
All right, so I'm going to skip ahead here. We were on slide 10. All right, so shifting gears to DHY. The Harwich Center study area being considered for DHY is comprised of parcels originally identified in phases 4, 5, and 6 of the CWMP. The study area is defined by 4 geographical sub-areas within the Herring River and Allen Harbor watershed. The DHY Clean Waters Partnership offers great opportunity in supporting the town-wide wastewater initiative, but brings with it unanticipated upfront costs not considered when developing cost recovery models and fiscal planning for the CWMP. Furthermore, taking on these unanticipated costs will likely have an unfavorable impact on short-term progress in East Harwich. To better understand the financial burden of sewering Harwich Center in conjunction with DHY, the town contracted with GHD to develop a sewer CAD model and updated budgetary costs for the 4 Harwich Center sub-areas. Sub-area cost estimates range from $12 to $18 million and combined for a total cost of $62 million in 2020 dollars. To provide a more comprehensive understanding of project costs over time, town staff evaluated the 4 study areas along with DHY planning documents to assemble a conceptual timeline for Harwich Center construction contracts. The 2020 budgetary figures presented in GHD's cost table were then escalated at 3% annually out to the anticipated year of construction, increasing the total Harwich Center construction cost by over $21 million. Should the town move forward with DHY and the Harwich Center study area, present data reflects a total cost of $83.2 million, and that is excluding the DHY plant. Before transitioning to discussion, I'd like to note a few additional considerations and cost-saving opportunities. With a cost estimate in excess of $83 million for DHY plus the plant, it's likely cost prohibitive to simultaneously further progress in East Harwich. The watershed permit and associated targeted watershed management plan activities should be considered if the town expects to transition from East Harwich to DHY. Another option is the town could consider reevaluating the CWMP phasing methodology to reflect smaller but more frequent construction sequencing. This would allow the town to adapt more easily to changing conditions and take advantage of cost-saving opportunities when they arise. Currently, there are 2 upcoming projects that could offer significant cost savings and/or sharing opportunities for the town. The first being a Mass DOT project scheduled to take place in 2024 that includes repaving Route 28 from the Dennistown line to the Herring River Bridge. Partnering with Mass DOT as a non-participating entity will allow the sewer mains to be installed under the Mass DOT project at a significantly reduced cost to the town. Ultimately, if we do it as a member of DOT's project, we wouldn't have to front the cost for the paving, only for the pipe. The second is the Route 28 water main replacement project currently being planned by the Water Department. The Water Department's project along Route 28 affords the opportunity to bid a combined utility project that would share the road restoration costs versus doing the projects independently and restoring the same road twice. And lastly, the town should consider developing a sewer CAD model capturing all 8 phases of the CWMP. The model will streamline evaluating phasing options, flow projections, preliminary design, and cost estimates. The model will also aid in evaluating changing conditions and cost-saving opportunities. Contained in this slide is one example or one of the many ways the town consider breaking up large projects. In this example, the DHY, this slide, I apologize, this slide is new today. I did slip a couple in to add a little bit more to the discussion. So I'll keep going. In this example, the DHY central study area has been broken up into 2 construction contracts, one containing the pump station and interceptor sewer line, and the second containing an expanded collection system for that particular sub area. To expand upon this concept, taking into account both DHY and East Harwich, I put together a quick back of the napkin phasing plan with available information and time. The construction cost figures in the table were derived simply by dividing the existing contract values in half. And they're intended to only represent the rephasing concept. So I just want to be clear that the cost table that was provided 2 or 3 slides ago, right? This one. So to put together the concept rephasing model or table that was in the last slide there, I simply took the construction costs that you see in this table and divided them in half. Now, should the town want to pursue that, that's not really the right way to do it. We need to go through and we need to actually break the contracts up, count parcels, flow, all of those different things, right? But here in this slide, you can see that, in my opinion, this is a lot more palatable than the bigger ones, the bigger, $20, $30 million construction contracts. It gives us an opportunity to really do it in a way that makes sense and allows us to adapt. And should the town decide to move forward with this methodology, as I just mentioned, the sewer CAD model would certainly better inform construction contract limits and cost estimates. And then lastly, one thing that you've seen consistently in a couple slides tonight is a TBD for the DHY plant. And I put that in there because the original plant costs that were proposed to the town were developed by taking all of the flow that wasn't going to Chatham and cutting it in half. And for graphical purposes, that was our flow commitment, right? Yarmouth and Dennis both also have to make flow commitments. And until we have flow commitments from the 3 individual communities, we don't know exactly what we're designing, what size plant we're designing. And until we know that, we won't really able to iron out a hard number for the plant. There was a number of numbers floated previously, but I think it's important for us to kind of wrap our head around the understanding that we all have to make flow commitments, and those flow commitments are going to drive ownership share in the plant and construction. So to put a price in here right now, in my opinion, would be a little bit premature without knowing where Dennis and Yarmouth are at with their flows. And then to give you something to work with, though, for the plant. Moving on to this last slide. Again, it's another new slide. I apologize that they weren't in here when the packet was sent out. But the last slide here is intended to be used as a quick reference for estimating, what Harwich's cost share of the DHY plant might be. In the example on the screen, again, these are round numbers for discussion, but if the DHY plant was $50 million and Harwich owned 10% of the flow, our cost would be $5 million. If the plant's 100 million, we're at 10 million. So you can see how the percentage and total cost have an impact. And until we know the flow, it is really a important component in plant cost. So that's my end of my slide. That's the last slide. Before I take questions, if I may just take the opportunity to thank Joe, Carol, Griffin for their support and discussions and preparation for this. It was an incredible amount of information to boil down, and I'm grateful that they were able to be a part of it. And Larry, again, as well to you for your conversation today. So,
thank you, Dan. One question before you speak of the CAD model, which seems to be critical if we want to give a good look at the data and is planning to. What are we talking about in terms of costs for that?
So we had a proposal for $150,000, and that would develop a sewer CAD model for all of the remaining areas in Harwich. So if we jump back up to the slide here. So right now, we only have a sewer CAD model of this red dotted line, right? The 150 would add infill everywhere else, including the existing conditions out in East Harwich. And they had also indicated that they'd be willing to put together a 20-year phasing plan to accompany that. So, you know, first part of that would be developing the model, and then we could, you know, town staff, as well as the consultant who's GHD that did the first model here, you know, we could sit down with them and start to digest and start to pick away and identify these sorts of smaller, more frequent contracts that we were referring to.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. Questions for Dan?
Yeah, Larry, it's Don.
Yes, please.
It's not a question for Dan, but I'm going to bring up what hasn't been brought up so that everybody can understand it. And thank you again for all this effort. Frankly, I think it would be, given where we are, to have an intelligent discussion, it would be a tremendous investment for us to do the CAD modeling for the rest of this, because it was eye-opening to do the initial portion, and it actually helped inform the discussion back when that happened. I just want to say one thing for anybody who thinks that there's not going to be a discussion about this. Larry, you know as well as I know, we have to have a discussion about the actual governance of DHY to even be able to get into how many gallons are going to go and everything, because there is an agreement that's in final draft at this point that everybody's looking at. So we're going to have to tear that thing apart, and the selectmen are going to have to look at all of that and then ask questions about how this thing works, because that's a whole separate discussion from the engineering part of it.
True, we need to bring that back. We'll do that very quickly.
And shortly, yeah.
Other comments? I will just make a brief comment. A lot of the phasing that Dan has discussed in this scenario, doing contract 3 and then doing the Harwich Center and that type, those are driven, I guess, primarily by cost considerations. I would point out as importantly, and this is why the CAD I think is important to us, these phases also need to be data-driven as we get additional information. And so that's a combination of making sense of the costing aspect of that, and then having a feedback loop is, I think Dan has mentioned, we now have going on in Pleasant Bay. So we're learning from the data going forward. And we certainly want to remove nitrogen that we're obligated to remove, but quite frankly, we don't want to move a pound more than that.
Larry, we also want to create some comfort level with the public and with our own board and with FinCom and Capital Outlay. We know this, but I think it needs to be bluntly stated. This engineering work that was done was wholly separate from the engineering work that was done to develop East Harwich sewering by David Young and his company. This was an independent analysis, correct, Dan? Correct.
Yeah, let me just one final comment I want to ask. I didn't anticipate a lot of questions on this tonight because, we applaud all of the effort putting this data together, but unless you're involved, this is really a lot of data to consider. So we'll bring this discussion back probably many times. And so we'll have a lot of additional chances to ask questions to inform us and the public of where we're going with it. So, but I think this is a great start. I would ask, while people are asking about questions, I guess I'll pinpoint a couple of Griffin, and I'll ask you if you have another comment, and I'll go to Carol.
No, I mean, Dan did a really good job of capturing a lot of information in as succinct way as possible. I think, as you said, we anticipate many more conversations moving forward and decisions. I think Dan and I have talked about this a number of times. We're happy to move any direction the town wants to move. Whatever makes the most sense. We're just trying to lay out all the information that we have and use our knowledge to help inform the board, but also help inform the public as well, so that we can, move together, move this project, the CWMP together as a team, really. And just one other comment on the CWMP. I know that sometimes there's some aversion to changing what's an approved, I guess, permit or plan. The CWMP is intended to be a living document, so it is intended to change as more data becomes available. And I think we're at a point now where we have more data available, so we're just doing the best that we can to use that data and to continue to develop in the most efficient way possible. We don't want to sewer areas that we might not get credit for. So that's really what, I think what's driving, Dan and I's sort of thoughts and try, as we try to lay it out to you folks to help make decisions moving forward. So thank you for this opportunity. I think it's great, and we look forward to more.
Thank you, Griffin. And Carol, at some point, of course, this is going to be pointed at you in terms of funding and budget, bonding costs and tax implications and so on.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to your conversation. I am working on long-term debt schedules for the town to look at tax implications that are associated with those schedules. I have the town's financial advisor reviewing all of the information just as an independent check for me, and then we'll be presenting that to you as well.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Joe, I'll turn it back to you. And as I said, I don't know if we have more questions, but this will come back over and over again.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Dan, phenomenal job. I know how many hours, countless hours that you've worked on it, and massage messages and data and everything else. And quite obviously a living presentation with last minute changes from DEP and other sources. But I think you did a phenomenal job this evening. And I know that Dan, Griffin, and Carol have been really getting into these discussions. And I'll be looking to get direction from the board as to what topics you want to start bringing up and when. But to build off of what Selectman Howell said, Selectman Ballantyne, Selectman Howell, Dan and Griffin and I will have a meeting next week, Friday, December 18th, of the DHY subgroup, which is populated by us and our counterparts in just about every area that's covered here, with Dennis and Yarmouth. We know that the town of Dennis has already affirmed a tri-town agreement concept. We know that the town of Yarmouth is discussing that through its Board of Selectmen on December 10th. And we know that they'll be looking to the town of Harwich. So this was, to me, a critical milestone to re-energize the conversation. It had lain dormant, mostly because of, the initial impact of pandemic. And then, as I've said before, if you will, we got lucky. And when I say we, I mean myself, Dan, Carol, and Griffin, because we were able to immerse ourselves in this topic ahead of the board looking for these kind of updates. But I would, go back to the document I presented earlier and some of the more immediate issues that are going to be coming up that the board may want to have more substantive discussions at your regular meetings would be around the DHY partnership. If the other two towns are looking to go forward on an agreement article at their annual town meetings in the spring. We know that there are different funding sources that are now available. I know Selectman Howell said last night about the Cape Cod and Islands Water Protection Fund, and we may have access to that. We've been talking about the Water Investment and Infrastructure Fund, or the WIF, And we now know that both Dennis and Yarmouth have impacted upon that. And I know Chairman Ballantyne, you've sort of equated that to the land bank payments coming past, which I think is a smart plan. But these are all things that we want to pay attention to, that we may need to have come before town meeting in May of 2021 or soon after. So again, to the team, great work to get us to this point, and thank you to the board for your indulgence to have this special meeting tonight to really reignite the conversation around wastewater.
Thank you, Joe. If there are no other comments, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'd like to make one comment because this
Please.
is not, things like this aren't a miracle. And I've been harping on this type of thing over the last several years, as you know, much to sometimes to your chagrin. But I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Joe, because it wasn't a miracle that we got to this point. He had a willingness to do a deep dive. He pulled together a team of all of the different elements that had to be part of this, including Griffin, Dan, Carol, and himself. And the education here is out of him educating himself about where we are and where we needed to be. So it's really important, because I did not see evidence of this over the last couple of years. We were just following along on a plan that was 5 years old.
Thank you, Don. Let me ask my fellow selectmen that Don has mentioned we need to bring back the governance discussion. We should do that very quickly. Let me ask the rest of you, are there other specific items? We're going to keep bringing this back in our call, but are there other specific items that you want us to add to the agenda in the next few weeks?
The Clean Waters Management Board.
Specific questions.
The Clean Water Management Board, that has to come back.
The Clean Water, there's two, the governance and the Clean Water Fund. We could bring those back.
It's not the governance,
Okay.
how much money we can get.
Thank you.
Yeah, Larry,
Michael?
I'd like to continue to discuss what we're sending to Chatham. I'd like to see if any other parts of Harwich, East Harwich, and different phases that we were going to do are being considered to try and get the taxpayers the 600 to 660 homes that we said and that we're paying for sent to Chatham.
Okay.
Great Sand
I
Lakes
see
was
Dan
one of
shaking his head, so.
Great Sand Lakes was one of them, and we've never approached Chatham about sending anything from South Harwich their way. So I think that that's a conversation that needs to be had. We've already made that investment, a very large investment, and we are going to be spending the taxpayers' money on something that we've told them what we were going to give them, and now we're talking about giving them at least a third less at a bare minimum that we're still going to be paying for. And I think that needs to be discussed before we continue to embark on a new plan.
Fair enough. It's an item that we will bring up. Okay?
Yep.
I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
Motion to adjourn.
Mr. Chairman, wastewater
Dan?
superintendent's looking.
I just wanted to I did write all of the narrative behind the slides down, so I will circulate that in case I went too fast.
Okay.
So re-reviewed through, so I will circulate that so everyone's got it. So that was all.
Thank you, Dan.
Did Ed want to say something?
Well, you know, the issue
Go ahead.
of if we anticipate or consider changing phases, getting a good discussion of how that will be received by the wastewater board in approving those changes of phasing would be important to have. And being sure of what that process looks like.
Okay.
And just if I may, Ed, what wastewater board are you talking about?
The state board, whatever.
DEP is the.
Okay.
DEP, okay.
Thank you. I just want to make sure we weren't talking about the committee that we don't have anymore.
No. The higher up approval bodies.
The two bodies that we need to get to review and agree to our plan are the primarily DEP and the county Cape Cod Commission, as they've taken on the role of keeping us in line with the 208 plan, which is driven by EPA. Sorry for all the different regulatory bodies, but it all comes, they all have to approve it. And then it floats up in the end to EPA actually, but the primary one is DEP.
If I may add to that, Ed, just so you're aware, when this letter came back to the town yesterday, I did follow up and had the opportunity to speak with Carol Ridley, who's running, I think, for lack of better words, the Pleasant Bay Alliance, for coordinating anyway. So she has reached out to DEP and tried to set up a meeting request so that we can have that conversation with them as to exactly what they would want from us should we decide to make any changes in what that process would look like. So working on scheduling that. I don't know if there's a hard date yet.
And to go along with that, Ed, I've had discussions periodically with Brian Dudley, who's our DEP person here, and very willing and very cooperative, as Dan mentioned before, working with us.
Yeah, I'm sure that approached right, they will be.
But Larry, if I could add one thing to that, on the CWMP side, I believe it would go through the MEPA office,
right,
for the state, through a notice of project change.
Yep, you're absolutely right. Because then the DEP connects with that.
Yep, exactly. EPA as well.
Okay.
Anything
Nobody
further?
else? I'll second the motion to adjourn.
Who made the first?
Who made the first?
I did, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. I'll take a roll call, but thanks again. This was for everyone playing together and for everyone. This is so we don't want to have two meetings back to back, but this was we needed this. This is a great start. I'll take a roll call. Ed.
Aye.
Don.
Aye.
Michael.
Aye.
And I'm an aye. So, good night, all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This conference is no longer being recorded.